Scary movies, Rae Stonehouse.
Who among us likes horror movies? A couple of people? Okay, what would be your favorite horror movie of all time?
Poltergeist.
Poltergeist.
I really liked Paranormal Activity.
Paranormal Activity. Okay, that's two. Those are fairly modern movies. Well, I have to tell you, I have not been a fan of horror movies. Not until this past week, and amazingly enough, this past week. Anybody binge watch TV shows on Netflix? I've been watching Amazon Prime. Amazon Prime is very familiar to Netflix, and they've had a show on there called 100 Years of Horror Movies. And it's been narrated by Christopher Lee. That may be a name that you don't recognize. The show was made in 1996, so it's 20 years old at this point in time. So we're 120 years into the horror movie. The horror movie, so this started back in like 1910, 1916. Black and white, of course. No sound. Now we think back, we see some black and white movies with no sound, and we think, oh, this is so lame, this is so old-fashioned. But if you lived 100 years ago, 120 years ago, and you were watching these movies on the big silver screen, you'd be absolutely amazed. It would be the same as us going to the show right now, seeing the new, I guess, 3D technology where you have the glasses on and the arms reach out at you, bombs come sailing at you, or even holographic technology, which is probably just on the verge. It's already out there. It's not quite in the show. But the technology for then would be just amazing. They couldn't believe that people would be doing things on the screen. And the actors, because they weren't able to speak, they did speak, but we just didn't hear them because they didn't have the capability to capture sound at that time. So you'd see the lips moving, but you didn't know what they were saying. So they had to pantomime, or they had to act out their actions. One of probably the most famous horror movie actors at the time was a man named Lon Chaney. Anybody ever heard of the name? Okay, Lon Chaney, and there was Lon Chaney Jr., which was his son. Lon Chaney was born to two deaf-mute parents. So to communicate with them, he had to learn sign language. And Lon Chaney was also a good mimic. He learned to mimic people's actions, and it helped him with communication with his family, with his parents. They call Lon Chaney the man of 1,000 faces, because he was able to portray the message of the horror that was going on at the time. And he was usually the bad guy. He was able to portray the message at the time just by because he didn't use voice, just by his facial expressions, or the way that he moved. If he was acting as a monster, if he was carrying a corpse, he would be lumbering. You can actually see him, like there was a lot of weight behind this corpse that he was carrying. Later on, they went on to different years, once sound started in. Of course, probably one of the most famous of all the horror movies, the genre was the vampire, Count Dracula. And there was three fellows that were probably the biggest, the quintessential Draculas, if you will. And that was Bela Lugosi. He was one. John Carradine, and then Christopher Lee. These were all people that took these roles on for years. Now, I didn't watch these movies because once they started in sound in the 20s, the 30s, and 40s, and the early 50s, long before my time. I watched them when they were in reruns in the 60s and later on. And there was typical monsters. You could probably name them all if you thought about it. There's Dracula. There's Frankenstein. Boris Karloff played Frankenstein. He was the quintessential Frankenstein. There's Lon Chaney Jr. So these are actors. There was Wolfman. There was the Mummy. There was Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Then other genres came in there within the horror genre. There was aliens from space that wanted to take over Earthlings. There was the Invisible Man and his close, the Invisible Woman, daughter of the Invisible Woman. They kept making them over and over again, and they expanded upon these horror genres. But my experience really was probably in the mid-60s. There was a show that probably still affects me to the day. And I think it was made probably about 1959. And it was called The Tingler. Anybody ever heard of The Tingler? Probably not. But if you were aware of it, you would remember The Tingler. The Tingler was this creature. The best I could describe it, it looked like it was about this big, and it looked like an intestine, a lower intestine, or a stomach. Think that picture. But it had about a couple hundred legs on it, like a centipede. And it was scoot all over the place. And I guess the idea was that it would grab and suck your soul out of you. The Tingler would get a hold of you. Well, when you're only 10 years old, what they said in the show, and I'm glad it didn't happen in the show that I was at, they said that it would be dark, the screen, it's a black and white movie. They introduced the Tingler, and all the kids are screaming, everybody's screaming. Well, whoever ran the theater, they would stop everything, they'd turn the lights on to make a very important announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, we've just received word that the Tingler is loose in this theater. So everybody was just pumped. You just feel your adrenaline rushing. And what they had done was they had wired some kind of a device into the seats. So then the owner flicked a switch, the seats all shook, and it scared the living life out of everything. I didn't see it at the show, so I only heard about this recently. I'm certainly glad that I didn't experience it. But where I experienced the Tingler was at the drive-in. So it was probably a 10, 15-year-old movie at this point. Now, back in those days, 2 parents, front seat, Volkswagen Beetle, 5 kids in the back. Well, that's a little tight for a drive-in theater. So what would happen is the older kids, myself and my 2 sisters, we would have to go out in the playground and play on the swings and all that, while everybody else, the rest of the family, the baby and the parents, sat in the car with the speaker. So all we saw was this giant scene and this great big monster, this Tingler going around. Well, I didn't hear the sound. I didn't know what the story was. I just know that there was this monster, and it was hiding in people's places and sneaking up on them. I must have had nightmares up until, well, last night. Really, I must have had nightmares, because I always had this idea as a child and as a teenager that there was the possibility, you had to admit that the possibility was there, that there was some kind of a creature that hid underneath my bed. Anybody else ever had that? And it's always a good idea to get down there and check. What happens is, it's nighttime, you know it's stupid. You know that there's no Tingler underneath your bed. However, you're lying there, and then you start hearing all the noises that are in the house. And you start thinking, and your mind starts wondering that, I didn't check everything underneath that bed. The possibility is there. You're in a dark room. The shadows take on different meanings. You see them in the daytime, it's just like this. You know exactly where everything is. But at nighttime, things take on. They're darker. You really can't, they're vague. You can't really see what things are. And did that just move? Did you hear sound? So you get the thought in your mind. And that's what a horror movie is all about. So I wasn't a fan at that time. When I was about 13 years old, my parents, I guess you'd call them, they were party animals. They didn't drink, but they went out partying. They used to go out every Saturday and Sunday night for a party. Then it started coming Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. As the oldest child, my role was to be the babysitter. And Friday nights were something really special. I grew up in Ontario. Friday nights. Does anybody know what's special about Friday night? 11:30? Fright night. If you grew up in Ontario, you get the American stations. ABC, Channel 7, from somewhere in New York, had the Fright Night movies. And these were these movies, the back of the Bela Lugosi, and the ones that, from the 40s and the 50s. They're playing them, partly because they're cheap, playing them that time of night. But when you're 13 years old, you're all alone, everybody else is sleeping, there's noises in the house, I'd have every light on in the living room. It'd be bright, and I'd have my back to the wall. So there's absolutely no way that nothing is going to sneak up on me. And the movies were absolutely terrifying. Back in those days, we had cable. we had a big console color TV. It was full color, so the movies were, well, they're still black and white because that's what they were. And we had 1 to 13 on the channels. So you'd turn the channel. Well, channel 7, it would get to the point that the movie was so scary that I just could not take it anymore. 13 screaming skulls, that's enough blood-curdling scream, enough to scare the life out of you. So just when I get to the bad spot, I'd have to go up and I'd change the channel. This was long before the days of remote controls. You actually had to get up out of the chair, which was of course dangerous. You get to the TV set, you change the channel. And you put it was CBC News. That time what else is on? CBC News. And you thought, well, this is getting awfully boring, and go back to it. And you look at it again, and you go, oh, look at that, somebody's going to get their head chopped off. Well, you did get their head chopped off. Change the channel again. The TV show, I just happened to watch the last episode before coming into this meeting this evening. It took it up for 100 years. It took it up to the point, and some of you will remember this, Jack Nicholson, The Shining. Remember Jack? He was trapped, all that kind of snow we have right now. He was trapped in a resort somewhere, and he went psychotic. Jack Nicholson, he's probably the definition of psychotic when he's acting. That's the point they went up to. But they were talking about some of the other movies. Jurassic Park had just come out. Jurassic Park is a horror movie. It's technology gone wrong. And that's really, in many cases, what the horror movies were. Whether it's radiation gone wrong, whether it's man trying to do something, mad scientists. You take a look at the movies that are out nowadays, and if you compare them to the movies from them, I don't think they're not the same. The monsters now, we'd more than likely laugh at them. If a Frankenstein came out, we'd probably think of them as like we've been spoiled by the Herman Munster style of Frankenstein. It wouldn't be as scary as it was back when it was black and white. The movies now, a couple of the names that you mentioned, what was the one that you mentioned? Paranormal?
Paranormal Activity.
Okay, there's not really a lot that took place in that, was it? Wasn't it mostly psychological? You didn't really see a monster come out. Other movies that were like that was the Blair Witch Project, which filmed originally in black and white because it was a night vision camera. You never really saw anything. How's my time doing there, Michelle?
You are 12:17, 12:18, yeah.
So it was black and white. You never really saw what was going on, but it was psychological. Another scary one I haven't seen, but my son says he wished he had never seen it. It's called The Ring. It never really showed a monster, but it was always something that was alluded to. So the style of horror movies have changed. So I'm thinking, where are we going to go in the future? Where are we going to go in the future? Is it going to be holographic? We're going to put ourselves right into those movies? We're going to be part of it? We're going to have an actual heart attack? I'm not so sure about that. But what I did learn from this, and I don't think it's a New Year's resolution, but I'm going to work on my leisure activities a little more. And I'm going to start focusing on seeing some of these horror shows that I've seen in this show, this 100 years of horror shows. And I want to start off with some easy ones. Anybody know or remember Abbott Costello?
Yes.
Abbott and Costello meet the Wolfman. Abbott and Costello meet the Mummy. These are black and white comedies. These are pretty low grade. So that's how I'm going to start off with checking or viewing horror movies. And I'm going to research them because I want to find out about what was going on. Because this show was interesting, showing the actors the stuff that was going on. Black and white. You know why everything was black and white? Because it was cheaper. It cost 10 times as much to show a movie in color. So that's why when you started seeing it, the producers would advertise, "See the monster in living color." You got there, the entire movie was in black and white, except for the 3 seconds that the creature was there. They put that in color, then went back to black and white because it was so expensive. So 3D is the way of the future, where things are going to go. My only concern is that, and ironically enough, I couldn't sleep last night. I worked 4 night shifts, and I went to bed and I couldn't sleep. So I was preparing this speech. And while I'm thinking my lines, there was a noise underneath my bed. I'm sure of it because everything was quiet. There was some movement down there. So from now on, in fact, when I'm gonna go to bed, I'm just gonna double check, it's not obsessive compulsive or anything like that. I'm gonna get there, and I'm gonna get a flashlight, and I'm gonna get down underneath the bed, because I know what's down there, it's just dining room table parts and extensions, I'm just gonna check. And I'm gonna, because they can get in between, they can hide, and I'm gonna go on the other side of the bed, and I'm gonna check on that side too, because you never really know. So when you get home, you check underneath your bed too. Madam Toastmaster.